Before you watch this story, ask yourself one thing. How far can revenge really drive someone? This isn't a story about a stranger in the shadows. It's about love, control, and the terrifying moment when both turned deadly. Her name was Cati Blauvelt, a 22-year-old army soldier with a warm smile and a soft heart for animals. She survived an abusive marriage. She rebuilt her life, step by step, until the man she once called her husband decided she didn't deserve to have one anymore. In October 2016, Cati walked out of her PetSmart shift, ready to start a quiet evening with friends. She never made it home. 3 days later, police found her body in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse, a place that had stood silent for 20 years, until it became her tomb. What drives a soldier to turn killer? How does love curdle into hate so black it devours everything? I'm your host, and this is the Guilty Crime Stories, where we uncover the truth behind the darkness people try to hide. Before the headlines in the courtroom, there was just Cati Blauvelt, a South Carolina girl with a quiet laugh and a fierce love for animals. Born on August 8, 1994, she grew up wrapped in the kind of everyday love that doesn't make the news. Siblings squabbling over the TV, a mom who knew when something was wrong by the sound of a door closing, and a daughter who always stopped to pet a stray. She dreamed simple good dreams, a steady job, a small place of her own, maybe a dog who'd run to the door every time she came home. In her early 20s, Cati was searching for what so many of us want: direction. Service appealed to her. Duty meant something. And that's how the army came into view. And with it, a man who seemed to represent everything she admired. He was John Blauvelt, a local army recruiter, smart, charismatic, the kind of man who looks you in the eye and makes you feel like your goals are already within reach. In uniform, he carried the weight of trust. Out of uniform, he had that easy confidence people read as competence. In a town like Simpsonville, a soldier carries a story you want to believe. They met by chance, a conversation that should have stayed professional. Paths crossing near the recruiting office. A joke shared. A promise that the army could be a ladder upward. But soon the conversations grew longer. Phone calls, late-night texts, flirtation wrapped in encouragement. He saw her potential. She saw his certainty. Together it felt like future. Cati enlisted. She tried to make the army her story too. A path to stability, to pride, to something larger than herself. But fate and health can be cruel. A medical issue cut that dream short. She didn't get the chapters she wanted in uniform, but she did get John, or at least the version of John he wanted her to see. The romance moved quickly, like so many do when you're 20 and convinced you found your anchor. Dinners turned into weekends. Weekends became drawers left open and toothbrushes side by side. Friends whispered about how fast it was moving. Family hoped the speed meant certainty, not storm. A proposal, a ring, a wedding. A future that looked tidy on paper and glowing in photos. She believed she was marrying a hero. Instead, she was walking straight into a nightmare. The earliest warnings rarely shout. They test the hinge of the door. Little comments about what she should wear, who she should see, how late she should be out. The way his tone sharpened when she disagreed. He could be charming in public, the helpful neighbor, the respected recruiter, and then possessive when the door clicked shut. Cati told herself all the things we tell ourselves. He's stressed, I misunderstood, tomorrow will be better. Then came the house, but not the home she wanted. Cati imagined a place for stability, the start of a family, a table where birthdays would pile up like rings on a tree. Instead, the door kept opening to teenagers, music too loud for a weeknight, and drugs that didn't belong anywhere near a soldier's kitchen counter. He was in his mid-20s. Some called it just blowing off steam. Cati called it what it was, a boundary broken. She asked him to stop. He didn't. The parties weren't just reckless. They were brazen. Alcohol, weed, and faces too young to belong in a married couple's living room. One face began to appear more than the others. Hannah, a 17-year-old whose admiration for John looked more like gravity. She hovered near him, laughed too quickly at his jokes, and stared at Cati like she was in the way. The arguments got sharper. The pleas turned into ultimatums. "Enough," Cati said. "No more." She'd married a soldier, not a ringmaster. But the house had become a stage, and she felt like an audience to her own life. You can trace the slide in small details. The day she stops inviting friends over, the way she checks the driveway before she goes inside, the careful language of someone trying not to spark a fuse. Possessiveness calcified into control. Control edged toward threats. Threats turned into moments that would later make officers underline words on reports. When a relationship turns, it rarely does so all at once. It leaks, it stains. It takes the shape of fear, then routine. Cati moved out, a brave, necessary step. She tried to reset her life, to put space between his anger and her future. A job at PetSmart. Time with friends. A breath that didn't taste like walking on glass. But the thing about men like John is simple and terrifying. When they lose control, they don't look inward. They look for a target. The resentment grew. The obsession simmered. And Cati, who wanted nothing more than to heal and move forward, became the focus of a storm she did not create. From the outside, they still looked like a couple sorting things out. On the inside, lines had already been crossed. Some you can't uncross. Friends remember the mask, John shaking hands, making small talk, playing the part. Cati shrinking from rooms she used to light up. The speed of their romance had become the speed of their unraveling, and behind it all a question was forming. Dark, heavy, unavoidable. What happens when a man who built his identity on authority decides the woman who left him must pay for it? What had started as a home, full of fresh paint, wedding photos and promise, slowly became something darker. As months went by, John Blauvelt's life drifted off course. The discipline of a soldier gave way to the recklessness of a man who thought rules no longer applied to him. The house on Fountain in Road turned into what neighbors would later call the party house. Teenagers came and went at all hours. There was alcohol, weed, pills, and stories of harder drugs. Music rattled the walls late into the night, and John was always at the center of it, drinking, joking, boasting about his time in the army. For Cati, it was like living with a stranger. She'd come home from work to find cigarette butts in the sink, beer cans under the couch, and unfamiliar faces in her living room. Kids barely out of high school. She begged him to stop, but John brushed her off, saying she was overreacting, that he was just trying to help the youth. Among those teenagers was a girl named Hannah Thompson, 17 years old, a high school student, bright, impressionable, and completely taken by John's charm. She met him through school recruiting visits. To her, he wasn't just a soldier, he was exciting, rebellious and dangerous in a way that looked like love. Investigators later said Hannah was like John's shadow. She followed him everywhere, like a puppy. She laughed at his jokes, helped him clean up after parties, and stared at Cati with open disdain. Cati tried to reason with her husband, but it was no use. John had found someone who idolized him, and he fed off it. Cati's friends remember the shift. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed. She began spending more time at her parents' home, avoiding the place she once called safe. The marriage, less than a year old, had already fractured. By early 2016, the situation turned violent. One night, during an argument, John pulled a gun and pointed it at Cati's head. She reported it to police. It was one of several incidents that showed just how much control and anger he'd buried beneath that uniform. The military took notice. The same army that once trusted him with recruits now saw the truth. A man unfit for the duty he once preached. He was disciplined, demoted, and stripped of his position, and in his mind Cati was to blame. She was the reason his career was collapsing. The reason he'd lost status, money, pride. His anger didn't fade, it evolved. He talked to friends about getting even. One teenager even recalled seeing a note on the fridge that read, "Get rid of Cati for good." By the time spring rolled around, Cati had moved out. She'd filed for separation and was rebuilding, slowly, her sense of safety. But John's world was spinning into chaos. He was drinking more, sleeping less, and keeping company with younger and younger girls who looked at him the way soldiers once did, with respect he no longer deserved. By spring, the man once praised as a soldier had become the kind of monster she'd only heard about in crime stories, and soon his obsession would cross the final line. When a man like John loses control, he doesn't reflect, he plots. By early October 2016, the cracks in his mask had widened into something unrecognizable. He'd lost his army position, his pay had been cut, and the respect he once commanded in uniform was gone. In his mind, Cati was the reason his world had crumbled. He told friends she had ruined his life, that she'd embarrassed him, that she'd pay for what she did. The words sounded like bitterness at first, but soon they became blueprints for revenge. Investigators would later uncover his Google search history from those weeks. Searches like, how to sharpen a knife, what to do when your wife dies, when can police tap your phone, each one do a glimpse into a man preparing for something unthinkable. While John's mind spiraled deeper into darkness, his 17-year-old girlfriend Hannah Thompson stayed by his side, loyal, unquestioning, and disturbingly devoted. She defended him to anyone who doubted him, saying Cati was crazy, that she was ruining his name. Friends would later say Hannah seemed proud to be the chosen one. She didn't realize she was helping. To fuel his rage, Hannah drove him places, listened to his rants, and became part of his plans, not as a bystander, but as an accomplice in waiting. Every time Cati ignored one of his texts or refused to speak to him, John vented to Hannah. He'd talk about finishing it once and for all, and while he obsessed, Cati tried to live again. She'd found comfort in a simple routine, working at PetSmart in Greenville, surrounded by the animals she loved. Friends said she was smiling more, laughing again. She'd finally signed a lease on her own place. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, calm, predictable, safe. Her family noticed the change too. Her mom, Patricia, said she seemed lighter, like she could breathe again. Cati was learning to move forward. Early morning shifts, dinner with friends, weekend walks. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, but peace has a way of making you forget how close danger really is. While Cati was rebuilding, John was watching, waiting, planning. He'd drive past her workplace. He'd ask people if they'd seen her with anyone new. He was tracking her life, even as hers was finally beginning again. Hannah's loyalty only deepened the madness. Investigators later said she enabled every move, chauffeuring him, lying for him, and encouraging his resentment. She wasn't afraid of what he might do. She was afraid he'd do it without her. In those final weeks of October, the tension around John was suffocating. He spoke less, but his eyes told the story, anger without end. He had already lost everything that made him a soldier. But the one thing he still had was the training, the discipline, the precision, the ability to execute a plan. And soon that training would turn deadly. She thought the worst was behind her. But he was just getting started. Sunday, October 23rd, 2016. For most people in Greenville, it was an ordinary fall afternoon. For Cati Blauvelt, it was supposed to be another quiet workday, her last shift of the week at PetSmart. She arrived early, smiling as she always did. Co-workers later said she was in good spirits, talking about getting dinner with friends later that evening. Her uniform was crisp, her hair tied back, her energy calm. After everything she'd been through, she looked lighter. At 2:15 p.m., Cati clocked out. She walked through the automatic doors, her phone in one hand, car keys in the other. It was a routine moment, the kind you never imagine will be your last, but somewhere nearby, John Blauvelt was waiting. According to investigators, he wasn't alone. Hannah Thompson, now fully entangled in his obsession, had dropped him off near Cati's workplace earlier that afternoon. It wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. He knew her schedule. He knew her routes. He had been tracking her for days. At 4:17 p.m., Cati's phone pinged one last time, a selfie taken from inside her car. No one knows why. Maybe she was sending it to a friend. Maybe she was just feeling good again. Whatever the reason, that photo would later help police confirm her final movements. Then, silence. Between 4:30 and 5:08 p.m., investigators believe John confronted her. Witnesses nearby later reported seeing a vehicle parked off Woodruff Road, similar to hers, but nothing seemed out of place. Just a few miles away stood an abandoned farmhouse, the forgotten structure that had once belonged to a local family, but had sat empty for over 20 years. Broken windows, dust-coated floors, the kind of place kids whispered about on Halloween. It was here that John brought her. We won't describe what happened in detail, but we know this. Cati fought back. There were defensive wounds. DNA later found under her fingernails told investigators she resisted until her last breath. When the fight was over, John dragged her body through a broken basement window and concealed her inside a rectangular concrete box at the center of the basement, a space barely large, enough for a person. It wasn't just a killing, it was vengeance, planned like a military operation. Afterwards, John's actions were cold and calculated. He took her car, a silver Hyundai, and drove it to a parking lot on Whitehorse Road several miles away. Surveillance footage later captured him abandoning the vehicle. Following closely behind was Hannah, driving his red GMC Yukon, his getaway car. He got in, calm as ever, and they drove off together, leaving the scene behind as if it were just another mission completed. Back at home, he cleaned up, erased messages, deleted photos. That night he called friends as if nothing had happened. To them he sounded normal, even cheerful. Meanwhile, Cati's friends began to worry. She'd never gone this long without replying. When she didn't show up to dinner, when calls went unanswered, the fear set in. By the next morning, her family reported her missing. Posters went up. Social media alerts spread. Volunteers searched roadsides and trails. But no one thought to look in that forgotten farmhouse, a place so ordinary it had blended into the landscape of the town. For 2 more days, Greenville carried on, unaware that a young woman who'd once dreamed of serving her country now lay buried beneath its soil. It wasn't just murder, it was vengeance, planned like a military operation, carried out by a man who'd turned his training against the one person who trusted him most. And when her body was finally found, even the most seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. When Cati didn't show up for work the next morning, her co-workers knew something was wrong. She was never late, never unreachable. By that evening, her family had already called police to report her missing. Officers canvassed her usual routes. Friends drove through Greenville's back roads, calling her name into the quiet. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Every hour felt heavier than the last. Her mother, Patricia, told reporters later, I just knew something was terribly wrong. For 3 days, search teams combed wooded areas and nearby highways. Flyers covered gas station windows and lampposts. To everyone who loved her, it felt like she had vanished into thin air. But Cati wasn't far away at all. She was right there, in the place no one thought to look. It was after midnight on October 26, 2016, when Wayne Rower, a mutual friend of both Cati and John, decided to search an old property they all used to visit as teenagers, the abandoned farmhouse on Highway 25. He walked through the sagging doorway, flashlight flickering over graffiti-covered walls. The air was still, except for the soft crunch of broken glass beneath his shoes. He called her name once. Then again, nothing. Down in the basement, he noticed something strange, a rectangular concrete box in the center of the room. Dirt scattered across the lid, a faint metallic smell in the air. Wayne's voice broke as he recalled that moment later. I looked inside, and I saw her. He ran outside, dialed 911. And within minutes, the place was swarming with police and investigators. When Detective Keith Muckrath and investigator Cheryl Schofield arrived, even they struggled to hold their composure. They'd seen violence before, but not like this. Schofield later said, "It was one of the hardest scenes I've ever walked into. She was so small. She didn't deserve that. Cati was just 5-1, a tiny little thing," her mother would say. Her daughter with dreams, trapped in a nightmare she never could have imagined. When officers went to notify John, his reaction would freeze them in place. He didn't cry. He didn't look shocked. He didn't ask how she died or where she was found. His first words were cold and unforgettable. "She flipped my life upside down." Detective Muckrath later said he had never seen such an absence of empathy. While investigators began gathering evidence, phone records, search histories, surveillance footage, John Blauvelt carried on like nothing had happened. He told people he'd moved on. He even attended the viewing at the funeral home, bringing Hannah with him to her family. That sight was unbearable. Patricia said, "It was like watching a wolf standing in the middle of the flock, and no one stopping him." In that moment, grief hardened into resolve. The family swore that justice for Cati would not fade, no matter how long it took. Cati's life was taken, but the truth, the full story of what he did and how far he'd run, was only beginning to surface. In the days after Catherine's body was found, John Blauvelt vanished. No goodbyes, no explanations, no trace. He packed a few bags, withdrew cash, and fled Greenville, taking with him the one person still willing to follow, 17-year-old Hannah Thompson. For investigators, that realization was chilling. The man accused of murdering his wife had just run off with a teenage girl who still believed she was helping her hero. Over the next few weeks, reports trickled in from across the country: Alabama, Texas, New Mexico, California. Each sighting placed John and Hannah hundreds of miles apart from where they'd been last seen, like ghosts drifting westward. The U.S. Marshals Service took over the case, labeling it one of South Carolina's most dangerous fugitive investigations. Marshal Will Cook, who led the search, later said he was cocky. He thought we'd never find him. But catching John wouldn't be easy. He wasn't a petty criminal running blind. He was a trained soldier, skilled in survival, combat and evasion. He knew how to live off the grid, how to change patterns, how to vanish. He was a trained soldier, and he knew how to disappear. The marshals built a psychological profile. They believed John was living like a ghost, relying on strangers' kindness, working small cash jobs and manipulating people for shelter. Every state line he crossed made him harder to track. Every town he passed through erased a little more of who he used to be. Meanwhile, Cati's family refused to let her story fade. They organized the Justice for Cati campaign online, Facebook posts, vigils, media appearances. Her mother, Patricia, never stopped speaking her daughter's name. "She didn't get to stop running," she said. "So neither will we." 2 months later, in December 2016, a break came. In Eugene, Oregon, police located Hannah Thompson, alone, scared, and exhausted. She had finally reached out to a family friend, saying she wanted to go home. She told investigators that she'd been living homeless with John in Oregon, moving from shelters to motels, sometimes sleeping in parks, but even then, she lied for him. She claimed he'd disappeared days earlier and that she didn't know where he went. It wasn't true. Phone records would later show they'd stayed in contact. Secret messages, burner phones, coded calls. Hannah had become both victim and accomplice, still under the spell of a man who'd destroyed everything around him. Years passed. Leads grew cold. The trail went quiet. Then in 2019, the case appeared on In Pursuit with John Walsh. Walsh called John Blauvelt a wolf in sheep's clothing, a soldier turned predator who thought he could outrun justice. The episode reignited national interest. Hundreds of tips poured in from across the U.S., each one giving investigators a sliver of hope. But the fugitive stayed one step Ahead, he used fake names, he changed vehicles, he worked odd jobs, blending into towns where no one asked questions. For 6 long years, Cati's family kept fighting while John kept running. They say time heals all wounds, but for some families, it just hardens the resolve, because no matter how far he ran, justice was moving toward him, mile by mile, and after 6 years on the run, his luck was finally about to run out. 6 years. That's how long it took for the silence to finally crack. 6 years of rumors, false leads and empty tips, until one piece of truth changed everything. By early 2022, the U.S. Marshals Cold and Complex Case Team had taken over the manhunt for John Tufton Blauvelt. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined digital traces, and reached out again to the one person who'd once followed him into the dark, Hannah Thompson. For years, Hannah had kept quiet, protecting the man who had used her. But this time, something shifted. She told investigators what they'd waited 6 years to hear. He's in Oregon, Medford. He's going by another name. That confession was the break they needed. Within days, the marshals tracked the alias, Ben Clean, a name tied to odd job listings, a used pickup truck, and a small rental house on a quiet Medford street. Surveillance teams moved in. Watching from unmarked cars parked across the block, they studied his movements, the way he carried himself, the slight limp, the tattoos visible under rolled-up sleeves. One stood out, the same pirate tattoo investigators had documented during his 2016 police interviews. It was the final confirmation. Marshal Will Cook recalled, "Once we saw that tattoo, we knew. There was no doubt. We had our man." On July 20th, 2022, at 4 p.m., U.S. Marshals and local Medford police closed in. As officers surrounded the house, John stepped outside to take out the trash, unaware that 6 years of running had just ended. They approached fast, shouting commands. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" Caught off guard, he froze, then tried to play calm. When asked his name, he said quietly, "My name's Ben." But they already knew the truth. Within seconds, he was in handcuffs, silent, expressionless, even in that moment. He refused to admit who he was. The woman he'd been living with for years, the one who believed she knew him, watched in shock as police swarmed her yard. Trembling, she told officers, "We've been together 6 years." He said his name was Ben. I had no idea who he really was. Inside the house, investigators found carefully constructed layers of deception, fake IDs, cash, and notes showing how he'd managed to stay hidden. John had built a second life, but even he couldn't outrun the truth forever. When Cati's mother, Patricia, got the call that he'd been captured, she cried. "Not from joy, but relief. I was over the moon," she said. "After 6 years, we finally got him." Her voice shook as she spoke those words, knowing the man who'd taken her daughter's life would finally face a courtroom instead of open roads. For 6 years he ran across states, through storms, through silence, always believing justice would never reach him. But justice moves quietly, patiently, and it never stops. After 6 years of silence, justice finally caught up with the man who thought he could outrun it. After 6 long years of waiting, September 16th, 2024, marked the day justice stepped into the courtroom. The trial of John Tufton Blauvelt, the once respected Army recruiter turned fugitive, began in Greenville County, South Carolina. For Cati's family, it wasn't just a trial. It was the end of a nightmare that had stretched across nearly a decade. Her mother, Patricia, sat in the front row, clutching a photo of her daughter, a silent promise that Cati would not be forgotten. The prosecution, led by Kinley Abbey and John Mears from the South Carolina Attorney General's office, presented a mountain of evidence. They pieced together a story of revenge, obsession, and premeditation, one calculated down to the last detail. Text messages between John and Hannah Thompson were projected on the screen for the jury. One of them read, "She's gone. I'm going through with that thing. Then came the journal entries I'd written in John's own hand. Someday I hope you understand why I did it. The girl was evil to me. I did it. Each line, like a confession, echoing from the pages of his own guilt. The jury watched as the prosecution replayed his disturbing Google searches, his deleted Snapchats, and the cell tower data proving he was near Cati's workplace that day. Then came the most anticipated testimony of all, Hannah Thompson. Now 25 years old, Hannah walked to the witness stand visibly trembling. Her voice cracked as she began to recount everything, the planning, the drive, and the moment John told her what he'd done. He said he killed her, she testified. He told me he threw her phone in water, and that he covered the blood with dirt. For hours, she painted the picture of a man consumed by rage and entitlement, someone who couldn't stand losing control. The defense, led by Paul Neely and Anna Walker, tried to dismantle her testimony. They claimed investigators had tunnel vision, that they'd zeroed in on John too quickly and ignored other suspects. They argued that DNA evidence was inconclusive, that Hannah's story had changed over the years, and that she was testifying for her own freedom. But the evidence, the digital trail, the written words, the confessions, was too strong. Even John's calm demeanor on the stand worked against him. He spoke with arrogance, not remorse. He described Cati as vindictive, blaming her again even as her family sat just a few feet away. On September 20th, 2024, after just over 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all charges. The courtroom fell silent. Patricia's tears flowed as she whispered, "We did it, baby. We did it." Judge Letitia Verdin sentenced John Tufton Blauvelt to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A life sentence for a man who thought he could run forever. But even in victory, a shadow remained. Less than a year later, on August 21st, 2025, Hannah Thompson, once charged with 5 felonies, including obstruction and accessory to murder, received a shockingly lenient deal. She pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and concealing a felony. Her sentence, 3 years probation. No prison time. Cati's family was outraged. Patricia called it a slap on the wrist, a punch in the gut to everyone who loved Cati. The community agreed. Hannah had walked free, while the woman she helped destroy could never come home. Justice came, but not without bitterness. Because in cases like these, even when the verdict is right, nothing ever truly feels fair. When the courtroom emptied and the cameras shut off, one truth remained. Nothing could bring Catherine Cati Blauvelt back. She was 22. She loved animals, laughter, and the idea that people could change. But she also lived in a world that too often excuses anger until it turns into violence. For her family, the sentence wasn't an ending. It was a pause, a breath after years of screaming into the void for justice. Her mother, Patricia, said she still talks to her daughter every day. "I tell her I kept my promise," she said. "I told her I'd never stop fighting for her." The Justice for Cati campaign became more than remembrance. It became a message, a warning about domestic abuse, coercive control, and how quickly love can turn lethal when one person believes another belongs to them. Because the truth is, Cati did everything right. She left, she sought help, she tried to rebuild her life, but sometimes courage isn't enough when the danger refuses to let go. If you or someone you know feels trapped, unheard, controlled, please reach out. Call a friend, tell someone you are not alone, and it's never too early to seek help, because behind every true crime story we tell here, there's a human life, not just a headline. Cati wasn't just a victim, she was a sister, a daughter, a friend, and a fighter who deserved a lifetime she never got to live. So tonight, as we close this story, we remember her and every woman who never got the chance to start again. Evil wins only when silence follows. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, and this is The Guilty Crime Stories, where we uncover the truth behind the darkness people try to hide.